How are you, Ben?
Hello, hello.
How are you? All
I'm
good.
good.
Thanks so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
Okay, if at any point you hear some purring in the background, it's my cat. She's a very she's a very loud purr.
Mine is around here somewhere. It's midday here, so she's probably lying in the sun somewhere.
Uh, Onto the subject of religion because we'll get into it and UFO religion at that. How many UFO religions are there currently in the world? I know that's probably a tough question, but that are not how many actually, probably, but how many are quite prominent, shall we say?
It's going to depend how we're counting it. So, are we counting, first of all, anyone who claims communication with a space alien and for religious or spiritual reasons? In which case, you have dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of individual channelers, many of whom don't have much of a movement, but they have sort of clients or sort of,
Okay.
they give talks and things like that. So, if we're going to include people who claim extraterrestrial communication, then the number is quite large. If we're talking actual like UFOs, like they claim they went onto a UFO or they saw a UFO or something like that, then it's much lower.
Yeah.
Um, and also, it would depend on what we're counting as sort of like a movement or a religion. Is it one channeler who sort of has a business doing spiritual readings and things like that and has clients but not really a community, or are we talking like people who feel like this is part of the group? Then again the number shrinks.
Okay. Okay. How did you get into the subject of ufology and religion?
Yeah, so I'm a big sci-fi nerd. I've always been into science fiction,
Okay, same
and
as me. Good.
so I remember growing up reading. I would read my dad's bookshelf, and I would read. This was back in the 80s, 90s. So I would read the classics. Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, that sort of stuff.
So you're a Foundation fan.
Yeah, I am. Yeah,
Me
yeah.
too. Me too.
Um, so let's see here. So I had sort of a sci-fi interest,
Yeah.
and then when I started studying religion, I it never occurred to me to study UFO religions until the 1997 Heaven's Gate suicides. And at that point, the media did such a bad job of covering the Heaven's Gate movement
Okay.
that that I really felt like I had to study it. And I was just a student at the time, but I said, well, I'll write my undergraduate thesis on it. And then it sort of went from there when I discovered there were other groups like this. And I think it's not surprising to me. People have combined sort of their interest in UFO and ufology and questions about space and technology and science and what's out there with religion.
Hmm.
It's so easily dismissed as just sort of ridiculous, but I don't think it is. So I think that's sort of what brought me into studying it.
Okay, that's interesting. On the subject of UFOs and would say the past, was a lot of people in the past. I know they would see flying objects and stuff like that, but they wouldn't naturally think of it as a UFO, but they would be looking to I suppose we've always been looking to the skies. Was that a big thing in ancient times?
Yeah, and there's a couple of books I'm blanking on who the folks were. Who's it might be well, I forget who it was who came up with a sort of a historical study of every claimed UFO sighting going
Wow.
back to antiquity, including things like the Book of Ezekiel, from the Bible,
Yeah.
where if you know the story of Ezekiel, it's, where the prophet sees this sort of chariot thing and it has like animal parts and it's flying through the sky. So that's included. Then there's sort of Babylonian and Egyptian and African equivalents. I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it's a multi-volume. So I mean, it's a long book. Anything weird in the sky, yeah, if we count that as UFO, then yeah, it's been since antiquity. Um, I think the one interesting question about that is, do they see it as technology? And clearly, like in the
Mhm.
Hindu epics, they do. So I think the Mahabharata talks about these, like, they sound like missile platforms in the sky, that they're sort of, in this great war, and
Mhm.
they're these divine missile platforms. And clearly there's sort of an idea of technology there. So I guess if that seems fair to call that a UFO. I believe those are called Vimayas. I'm
Okay.
not an Indologist, but I edited a book, and what person studying that wrote a chapter, so I'm remembering it from there. So yeah, I mean, we could trace it back to antiquity, and then I think post the flying saucer sightings in the 1950s, it takes on sort of a new identity. At post 1950s, it's in the space race and the atomic
Yeah,
age.
yeah, yeah.
It looks different, but yeah, I think it's been going on for as long as anyone knows.
There seems to be a big kind of surge now with UFOs, especially with the Pentagon releasing stuff. Do you reckon that's going to just start surging into the whole religious UFO aspect even more?
I think so. Given that, well, actually, it's there's an interesting sort of irony here that when the
Mm.
government was denying anything to do with UFOs, actually groups were doing quite well as well. So
Okay.
I'm not sure if, and that's because a lot of sort of ufological oriented people, ufologists and
Hmm.
UFO movements are quite content with sort of conspiratorial thinking. The government is hiding it.
Yes.
So that's,
Yes.
and we know, of course, governments do hide things. So that's not, that's not a stretch to claim.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think paradoxically, in some ways, even when the government, didn't admit they were tracking UFOs, it didn't put a damper on ufology and UFO religions. Now that they've admitted they've been tracking it and studying it, I would think there'd be even more interest because now there's sort of like more data out there. But it's not because there ever was a lack of interest. It's just that now there's more stuff to look at.
Right. Okay. I'm wondering, is there some religion dedicated to Oumuamua? Remember that thing that passed through
Oh
our
yeah,
solar
yeah. From
system?
the now, did they ever decide was that from another solar system? I can't remember.
Yeah, there was. I had actually the guy who wrote the book on it on the podcast, and he reckons it could have been a sail, maybe a sail, like a light sail. But I think I don't know what's the. Did someone. There's always people trying to discredit. Everyone's trying to discredit everyone else, so I don't know exactly what's the
Trying to
story
remember,
with that
didn't it,
now.
it? It went by so fast, we'll never see it again, right? Wasn't that? It was sort of like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm sure there's some people out there worshiping that somewhere.
I wouldn't be surprised. I should poke around afterwards. I'll Google it and then
Yeah, yeah.
I'll poke around and see what else I can find on some of the message
Spe-
boards. That one
Speaking.
reminds me of the I think it's Star Trek 4 with the beings would send the sort of a probe, and to talk to the whales. But I think
The
it looks
whales,
sort
yes.
of that long shape. So I thought maybe it was, they're here to talk to the whales.
Yeah, you never know. It could happen.
You know,
Speaking of back to Heaven's Gate, um, why do you think certain people kind of, I'm not, fall for it is a bad word, but like that they believe it? What do you think? And I don't mean to be bad against those people. Do you think some people in those kind of groups actually have kind of mental problems that that's why they believe. I know that sounds like an awful thing to say, but I mean, because some of the stuff you're like, how is that could, if you logically thought about it, it doesn't make massive sense of like to kill yourself and then you're going to go into it.
so as far as we know, the members of these sort of groups are no more or less prone to mental illness than the general population. So certainly
Okay.
there were people who were, but my interpretation of Heaven's Gate, and particularly the idea of suicide, was it was never a suicide group. It was always a group about leaving the Earth and getting to outer space, and they were sort of backed into the corner where suicide was the last option they had. They kept waiting for the UFO to land, and they just kept waiting. They believed so strongly in extraterrestrial life and that's where salvation was, and the UFO was going to pick them up. And when it just wouldn't land, they slowly, sort of year by year, began to give up on ever getting physically on board, and that's when they began to embrace suicide. But it didn't start that way, so I don't think anyone joined thinking this is a suicide group. Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, a person who joins a group knowing it's a suicide group, I think that, yeah, I think we'd have to think about mental illness as sort of, is there a reason? But everyone who joined thought they were going to get onto the UFO in bodily form, like walking on or being lifted up with a tractor beam, basically. So I think that eventually they were sort of backed into suicide, but that wasn't where they started.
Okay.
Were they crazy? I mean, that's first of all, I don't know, and none of us can know because they're not
Yeah.
here to go as a psych assessment on. There have been people who have died for or killed for their religion for thousands of years. So I don't, on the face of it, simply dismiss them as crazy because of that. If
Hmm.
I did, we'd have to say all the Christian martyrs in like the second and third centuries are crazy.
Okay.
Or to take your pick, suicide bombers too. I mean, any of these people, if you die or kill for your religion. No, I don't. I neither approve of neither of them. I don't believe in martyrdom or suicide bombing are good things, but
Yes, yes.
I don't think they're crazy. I think they have reasons that make sense to them.
Okay, I get
Yeah.
you. I
Does that make
get you.
sense?
Yes, yes. I totally understand. Why do you think those certain people are drawn towards kind of the fanatical UFO cults? Like,
It's really interesting. So for Heaven's Gate in particular, and that's the one I
yeah.
know best, I'll use that as an example. Probably about a third of people were drawn in really out of interest in UFOs and sightings, and this started in the '70s. So there was this Project Blue
Mm,
Book. There was all this stuff about is it real or not, and then the military is investigating the government, and is it a conspiracy? So there were people deeply into that who joined because their primary draw was they wanted to know about these sightings and the UFOs, and they were sort of in that milieu. There were also people who joined because they were spiritual seekers and they had tried other stuff
mm.
too. They had tried, Scientology, or they had tried living on a kibbutz, or they had tried LSD and drug trips. So they were like looking for meaning, and this is just one more thing. And the thing is, there's a revolving door. A lot of those people left. Like most of them didn't stay, but a few stuck around, right? Um, and then I think you also have people who were into sort of the Christian aspects of Heaven's Gate in particular. But Heaven's Gate and the Raelian movement, which is another UFO group, both really are into the Bible, and they're into interpreting the Bible in terms of the UFO. And Heaven's Gate was very apocalyptic. So people are interested in like
Right.
biblical prophecies and reading the Book of Revelation and trying to figure out what does this bowl of wrath mean, or when the lampstand gets knocked over, what's so if I mean, there's been new religions about that forever. Like the Branch Davidians in Waco. I mean, they were reading the
Mhm.
same Book of Revelation, right? So members of Heaven's Gate read it and said, okay, this is about UFOs. So you have all of that. You have the UFO angle, you have the Christian angle, and you have just sort of the spiritual seeker angle, and then that's Heaven's Gate. And I think it's probably the same for other. Sorry, there's a train in the background. I don't know if
It's
you like
okay.
that.
It's all good.
Yeah, it's the same for other groups too.
Right. Do you think without I know we're trying to psychoanalyze people here, but do you think it's a certain amount of there's a certain amount of fun in something like that that people think they're going into something that no one else kind of knows about, and it's their like little thing, like almost like a group kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right there. I think there's a real psychological. I'm not a psychologist to be clear, but I
Yeah.
think there's a real psychological draw uh, to thinking that you're special and you have special access to the truth. And I think we see this particularly in new religions, but really any religion. I mean, people who, evangelists are trying to convert people to their own religions because they generally think they have the
Yeah.
truth. But when
Yeah.
it's a new group, sort of a secret truth, an esoteric truth, yeah, I think that offers incredible value to a person to say, look at me, I'm special. I have access to the truth. I have a role to serve in this great grand adventure of life, the universe, and everything. To quote Douglas
Yeah.
Adams.
Yeah.
The this will seem like a non sequitur, but here this will make sense if you give me a minute. I was listening to the radio the other day, and there was a story about a nurse at an American hospital who snuck into a room to a Christian person who went to baptize babies without telling the parents, and they were caught
Okay.
doing this. Was a big deal, right? But she said, "Well, I had to save their souls." Like, think about how powerful that claim is. You alone can save someone's
Yeah.
soul or have access to the truth. I mean, that's the power of religion. You alone know the truth that can save people. I mean, you can see the draw, and then when
Yeah.
it's something like so arcane like UFO, you can see
Yeah.
why only I know this. Everyone else thinks I'm nuts, but I know it's true, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You can see the power.
I get you. I always feel like the leaders of those the things, the guys that have the main god complex, shall we say. I always feel at the start they kind of know it's a bit bullshit, but as they get further on, they actually start to believe their own hype. Do you think that's probably the case?
Well, so Heaven's Gate's interesting in that way because it has two founders, and Applewhite, the male founder who was around at the end, was basically confused at the beginning. He said, "I'm hearing these voices. I feel like I have this religious mission. I'm having sort of this." He didn't say breakdown, but I'm having sort of this. Things are falling apart. And it's Nettle, his co-founder, who says, "Oh, actually, we're going to do a star chart, and we're going to, figure out, okay, you have a prophetic destiny," and sort of so he's sort of, not dragged, but he's sort of pulled into it. Did he believe, and to expand to other religions like this, do the founders typically believe it? Uh, I think you're right. They definitely come to believe it.
Yeah.
It's probably more common than not that at least at first they're not sure. I mean, if most people are rational, and I do think most people are rational, to claim that you're like, Jesus, or that, God's a space alien, or choose any other, sort of claim, it's an extreme claim. So I think I'm not surprised that people sort of, wonder about it. But I think you're right. After you've been doing this for a while, and after a leader or a founder has a group centered on them, and they keep going, it makes sense they become fully invested.
Yeah.
But again, who knows? That's the thing. I mean, for all we
Yeah.
know, all of these people are making it up and don't, or they're deep believers. We have no way of knowing, right? That's part of what makes it so interesting.
Yeah.
I read about compulsive liars before. People who are compulsive liars, that they tell a lie so much that they actually, in their brain, they actually have come to believe that lie.
They tell
Oh,
it.
They're actually they're like, no, I'm not lying. So for them, it's truth,
fascinating.
and that's why they get angry.
Oh, yeah, because you could probably do like a neuro study, like a brain scan,
Yeah.
and you could
Yeah.
probably see, yeah, that makes total sense.
It does, especially when you know people who are compulsive liars.
And they get
Yeah,
angry when you catch them out of their
I
life.
was about to say I don't know any, but if I did, I wouldn't know, right? Because
Yeah.
so I may know some. Yeah, but memory is so weird that way. I mean, that's relevant for UFO religions too, in terms of like the sightings and things. I mean, we know that memory is this funny thing, and that if you
Mm.
tell the story enough, you start to believe it, as you said. And what is the true memory there? Particularly when it's like recalled memories under hypnosis, or something like that. I think we have no way to tell what's a real memory, even what real means. Oh, this is a podcast. People are listening. They don't see my scare quotes. I'm holding my
Oh,
hands up.
they'll see it. Don't worry.
Oh, they'll see it. Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if they're just listening too. If you're just listening, there's scare quotes here. What is a real memory? Who knows, right?
Yeah, memory is a strange thing. Like I remember me and my friend, we saw, well, what we think we saw was a UFO. We're on the beach one day and there was a light like well past us, and then we're walking up a bit and it was like, it was way closer than anything could move. It was like on us by that stage. Now I'm not sure how real that really was. I know the both of us can talk about it at that, but some of those things you're like, we tend to embellish things, and then as when you're younger, they kind of grow into a thought. So there's always that kind of thing. Was it as much as real as we thought it was? Even though we did see a light, and we did see, fear can almost change things in you as well.
So I think that's why I find studying religion and UFO religion so fascinating. So
Yeah.
it allows me, because I'm using a religious studies lens as opposed to psychology or debunking or something, to say, well, whether it happened or not is irrelevant. It's no more relevant whether you actually did or did not see the UFO, whether the some particular saint actually did a miracle or not. That doesn't matter. What matters for a saint is people believe they're a saint. They believe the miracles are real. So there's like pilgrimages and churches and all the stuff people do. So what matters is, for UFO sightings, not so much what was it, but what are the effects? I mean, as a person found a religion based on it? Did they become sort of a channeler, a spiritual seeker or thinker? I mean, that's real. Whether the UFO was or wasn't, who knows? I don't. I don't know.
I always feel like people, they should have their own beliefs, and if whatever they believe. But when it starts getting into like, let's kill ourselves, that's probably when the whole thing's gone off the rails.
Yeah, and again, I mean, Heaven's Gate's the example there. There's relatively few UFO religions that are prone, I think, to violence, because it's not a violent ideology.
Yeah, it's very esoteric kind of thing to be into, isn't it?
I mean, if you have a religion founded on an idea of like, I'm trying to think what would be prone to violence. A group which saw itself as part of like a war, between like angels and demons or something. Then you can maybe expect they're prone to violence. Apocalyptic groups like this. I mean, well, remember the Om Shinrikyo? They were the Japanese subway gas attack. I mean, they were apocalyptic, right? So understand a group which thinks that they're living in the end of times is maybe more prone to violence, although most of them aren't. But UFO religions, there's just no reason they should be violent. So Heaven's Gate's sort of the exception in that way. And I think, again, they were sort of stuck by their theology. Like they needed to get off the planet. They didn't know how.
Right. So there was nowhere to go really for them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When I think about other UFO religions, like Aetherius, I mean, Aetherius I think George King was the founder, and they're mostly in the UK. They're about like healing the planet. The very same idea of like space aliens are here to like talk to us and save us, but theirs is about like heal the planet. That's a much more, I think, typical UFO religion message is, aliens are here to help us and not let's all kill ourselves.
Okay. It's quite an interesting thing, because normally science and religion don't go together, but UFO religions are basically, they're combining both things, aren't they?
Yeah, and that's part of what it got me to stick with studying UFO religions. Actually, is
Okay.
because eventually, while find them fascinating, I thought, but so what? I mean, if it's like 40, that doesn't matter. I think that's one of the so what answers. I had an advisor in graduate school who said, "What's your so what?" And I said, "Well, this is part of the so what. You can't be a modern person, a person today, and not engage science and technology. I think you can, and I think it's been that way at least since the birth of the atomic age, maybe earlier, but at least since everyone I know has been alive and thinking. It's been we live in an era where with a push of a button we can nuke ourselves to non-existence, or we can by slow ignorance destroy the planet as we appear to be doing, right? So
Yeah,
with
yeah.
global climate change, I mean, so our technology, our science can destroy us. It's hard not to see the relevance. It also can save us. Think of all the cool things science and tech can do. We can like walk on the moon. We can
Yeah.
cure diseases which previously would have decimated us. Sometimes we can, but we live in an age of science and technology, and I think you're right. UFO religions are some of the most explicit at saying we want to grapple with that. And they put technology at the center of their religion, not as a hack or an add-on, which an older religion would have to do. I mean, you can find Christians, Muslims, Jews who sort of, have a place for technology, but those religions are ancient. As a new religion, it's not an add-on, it's not a hack. It's from the birth of UFO religions. They've always been about technology and science.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's science. It's cool. Do you from studying theology? Do you study other theology apart? You study most other theologies. Do
Yeah,
you
yeah. I mean,
find?
well, I teach very broadly. I'm in a liberal arts college, so I teach. I was
Yeah.
teaching Hinduism yesterday, for example. So I'm no Sanskritist, and I don't. But I can. I've read sacred texts of a lot of religions and studied their history. So I'm
Okay.
good enough for 5 minutes.
Okay, that's cool. Do you
Maybe more than that.
find
Maybe an hour.
do, do you find do you find there's more people are becoming less religious? Because I can only speak for Ireland. I remember, I think with all that stuff with the Catholic Church, it kind of really, with that nefarious stuff they're up to, it really soured a lot of people in Ireland. And I think Ireland definitely isn't as religious as it was. It definitely isn't as religious as it was. Do you find, is there a less growth in religion?
The data is clear that over the long-term trend in Western and Northern Europe and Canada has definitely been towards secularization, is the term we use for that. So the decreased power of religion and also decreased adherence. The United States is sort of weird. We seem to buck the trend here.
Okay.
However, the numbers for adherence for membership are certainly declining. Americans may be as religious as we were 20, 30 years ago, but fewer belong to particular religious communities. That much is clear.
Okay.
And it may simply be, I mean, some churches are shrinking, but actually most churches are on average shrinking. The ones that are growing may just be the exception. Is it because the younger generations, the millennials on forward and Zers are just, they look at like religion, they see like child abuse and televangelists and abortion protesters, and they think that's not, this is not for me. So of
Mm-hmm.
course they're not going to want to belong. Or is it something about like the modern world? And that's the big debate. Is it something about sort of living in modernity where religion is less central? And there is sort of a debate over that. But to answer your question, yes, absolutely. Certainly in the case of Ireland and with very few exceptions, Europe. I mean, there's a few exceptions. Poland's sort of an odd case, but
Yeah.
most of Europe, at least Western, Northern Europe, certainly is what you're describing. And Canada and probably the US too, but in sort of a different way.
Yeah. I would probably deem myself agnostic. I would never say I'm an atheist, because I would think saying you're an atheist is quite of like arrogance to that. Like that that what you're saying, you know what I mean? It's like, well, you don't know and I don't know. I'm open to the idea, but I think just being I think a lot of people are actually more agnostic than atheists, even though people aren't believing in it. I think people are still open minded about it, I think.
Yeah, and there's also sort of like the functional agnostic category, a person who still belongs to a religious community but doesn't really know if it's true or not, but it's going because it's convenient, or it's part of their ethnic heritage, or it's part of their family, or it's just sort of what they've always done. But if you ask them like, what is your theology, it wouldn't match like what they belong to. We see that a lot. So there have been some really good studies in the U.S. It's the Pew Forum, which runs sort of these big studies, but there's analogous ones in the European social science studies, where you ask someone, ask a Catholic, like, do you believe? Then you list like 10 Catholic doctrines, and like, they don't believe any of them, but they say they're a Catholic. So we're going to count them as a Catholic. You say you're a Catholic, but you don't believe in the virgin birth, and you don't believe in, the intercessionary prayer to the saints, but you say you're a Catholic. So we're going to count you as a Catholic. You say you are, so we're going to count you. But you don't believe Catholic things. What do we do with you? So yeah, I think agnosticism. There's probably agnostic Catholics too, and it's like, well, might as well go. You never know. I've not seen the numbers on that, but it seems plausible to me.
And I know I'm probably jumping off base here, but is there any religions that are to do with, we'll say, psychedelics? Because I know when people take there's a lot of, especially oh geez, my brain isn't working. There's a certain psychedelic and I can't think of it, where people go in, like they see it'll come back to me. But is there any like religions based on just purely like psychedelics? And
sure.
Or are there?
Yeah, there are, and some of the fastest growing new religions are probably psychedelic based ones. So you might have been thinking about, is it ayahuasca?
Which it's no, I wasn't thinking about ayahuasca. I was thinking about, jeez, what do you call it?
I mean, there's
DMT.
DMT, yeah, the DMT, yeah. So there's a whole bunch of these that are that I think are pretty fast growing. There's actually some scholars working on this. I know some folks who are working on books on the study of religion and psychedelics and drugs. I have a colleague at Emory named Professor Gary Latterman. He teaches an entire class on religion and drugs.
Cool.
About
wow.
Look him up. Gary Latterman at Emory. And there's others. I think Brad Stoddard at somewhere in Florida. I think he's working on a project. I don't know, but stay tuned. There'll be some books out on religion and psychedelics. Cool. But I think, and I've not read their work yet. But and Chris Partridge also. Chris Partridge in England has published on religion and drugs. So I think, pardon my cough. All of them, I think, are looking at this sort of interesting intersection with the UFO angle in particular. There were some early sort of psychedelic ufologists who said, they read their Carl Jung and they were all into their archetypes, and they understood sort of that through the use of psychedelics they could sort of connect to either beings from actual outer space or beings from other dimensions, and sort of transdimensional space aliens, because there's that whole angle too. So there were sort of early 1970s, 1980s examples of psychedelic ufology.
Okay. It's interesting.
But there's a bunch of folks working on it or who have worked on it recently. You can find for your program.
Wow, I can see why. Like, I mean, I can speak for myself, but I've dabbled in the old magic mushrooms, and when you take too much of them, especially, you do have that feeling of like, geez, I've seen the universe. So that you can see why people, especially I know people I've never taken DMT. But people who've taken DMT, they do all speak about like meeting these beings from other things. So you could see why that would kind of seep into the consciousness of that.
Yeah, I've not read any studies on DMT in particular, but again, it's not surprising. I mean, more of the work I think is on mushrooms or ayahuasca or peyote. And peyote's been studied for a long time, right?
Yeah.
And again, I don't know all the brain chemistry, and you got me in like what's going on in the brain, but the spiritual claims again are what's interesting to me. And I don't think we should dismiss it just because it's brought on by a compound, because I mean, people have been having spiritual experiences through like fasting or dancing or meditation. It's all brain chemistry. It's all going on in the brain. But to quote Dumbledore, just because it's in your brain it doesn't mean it's not real. I mangled the quote, but I kind of know what I'm talking about. Of course it's in the brain, but that doesn't mean it's not an actual experience.
Yeah, there's so much, but like the brain is just such an odd thing. It's like no one really knows what dreams are. Like, what are dreams? I don't think anyone can actually specifically tell you what a dream is, because they're like minute thoughts during the day that add into some crazy movie you have at nighttime.
There's an old theory of religion, I mean, from like the 19th century, that it was dreams that led to the first religions. That people, were trying to figure out, what is the thing we do? And is it
wow.
real? And are we going somewhere? And are we getting meaning from it? And I mean, it's not provable, of course. It's just a theory, but it's interesting. It's provocative, and it sort of makes sense. I mean, who knows if it's true? I mean, they're imagining what it was that, like, Neanderthals were doing, but it makes a certain amount of sense. Like, it's weird. Yeah, dreams are weird.
I had a guest on the podcast who's a philosopher, John Leslie, before, and we are just talking about theories of like what, the concept of death and living forever. And one of his concepts was that we all live forever because the past is always happening. So essentially you're living in the past. But another one he had was that, like, just talking about stuff, he said that we could be just a thought in God's brain, which that to me is it's a crazy thought, but like, it could be true. Like, I mean, he could just have a thought and that could be just, we're living, if someone's all powerful. So
I've run across, is studying UFO religions. I often I'm studying groups that are part of the broader New Age movement, whatever we're defining that as. I've run across sort of the holographic theory as well, which is sort of similar. That we're holographic projections, and we look real as much as a holograph looks real, but in fact, we're not really here. We're sort of a projection from somewhere else, and often there's all this sort of weird quantum theory involved, which I don't really understand, but it's for proponents of this, it deeply ties physics and religion and spirituality and philosophy together. And again, I don't have to understand it. All I need to know is that it makes sense to them, because then
yes. That's what I always thought about ghosts. When people see ghosts, they never really interact with the ghosts. So I always thought maybe that's a universe crossing over for just a split second and someone's walking through somewhere or something like that.
And I have looked at studies on mostly in North America, but it's probably the same in Western Europe as well. That, I mean, belief in the paranormal has never declined, even in the modern era. Like, people were no less likely to believe in ghosts or spirits or hauntings or things like that now than we were like 100 years ago, which is remarkable, because people thought, I think, with science and technology, that we would all become like, rationalists.
Yeah.
Which assumes, of course, that it's irrational to believe in ghosts. That's an assumption. But whether it is or isn't, we haven't. I mean, we clearly still do believe in all sorts of mystical, magical, supernatural things. And despite living in an age of science, and in fact, fusing it. Think about, I don't know if you have on your TV in Ireland, but here in the US, we have, like the ghost hunters.
I've seen those terms.
They have, like all these little contraptions. It looks like Ghostbusters, right? So little like beeping boxes, little things like that. But it's the use of science technology to study, like, the occult.
Yeah. They're hilarious. Like, I find that their guys definitely convince themselves. They're like, "Did you hear that sound?" And like, right. Yeah, it was your shoe moving, dude. It's like, oh my god, I've seen that. It's like, bro, come on.
We had an article on them in the journal I edited. I edited the journal Nova Religio, which is the journal for the study of new religious movements. So we had an article on the paranormal, the ghost hunter people. My point was they use technology. That was all I was going to say. Is they use sort of these, I don't know what they do, but they're little beeping boxes and things.
Yeah, it's kind of like that thing of when you're a kid. Like, that stuff is so exciting. So when you get older, you're still continuing that in like a weirdly childlike way. Because that's what I see it as. I see it as grown-up dudes acting like kids.
Listen, let's be honest. I mean, it's got to be a fun life.
That's hilarious. I'd love it.
There are worse jobs to have, right?
But it's going back to that thing of like, that we were talking about earlier. I think they know at the start, it's like, okay, this isn't true. And then they kind of start to believe it. And then you can see that they believe it. You can see those guys kind of believe it.
Yeah, and again, I can't get in their head. I don't know if they actually believe it or not. But I want to separate actual fraud. Like, there are people who actually are engaged in fraud, like bilking people, like faking paranormal to try to get people to to send in money, things like that. We should separate that from people for whom maybe it is, it's part of their livelihood, but it's not that this is, they're not fleecing the public in a certain way. I mean, there's a big debate about this, man. Like P.T. Barnum, talked about, how there's sort of, there's a fleecing the public to entertain them is okay. So maybe actually it doesn't matter if it's true or not. But I agree. I mean, there's, I do think there's a difference between those who believe it and those who don't believe and are simply trying to use duplicity to make a buck.
Yeah, Yeah, those shows are big. Do you actually believe in aliens yourself?
Well, I believe they're out there. I think,
Yeah,
I'll quote Carl Sagan here: "If they aren't, it's a big waste of space." Right?
yeah,
The claim that we are the only intelligent life in any universe of its size and scope is an act of incredible hubris. I think it boggles the mind to think we're that special, where we'd be the only ones. So I certainly believe that there's life and intelligent life out there. I am agnostic about any particular claim that it's visited us. I'm well aware of sort of, I think it's the Drake equation, which talks about the chances of ever encountering intelligent life. I'm not a mathematician, so
mm,
it, it um, I would not be surprised if we have been visited or will be visited by intelligent life. I also wouldn't be surprised if we aren't,
yeah,
and never will be, because of the massive distances in time. So I mean, I'm agnostic about the details, but about the sort of the philosophical possibility of there being intelligent life out there, I think there has to be, just that, if based on the size of the universe. And I take it seriously. So if a person says to me they've talked to an alien, I don't dismiss it. I mean, I don't necessarily believe them, but it doesn't matter if they
I
think
get
it's
you.
true. I'm interested in that.
I getcha. Yeah, I think the whole alien stuff was. I think it was more interesting pre-internet because it was something more like unknown about it. Where now you can kind of see all the stuff that they faked and all this kind of stuff. For pre-internet, you could kind of be more like, "Oh my god, that's definitely true," you know?
Well, I think, and the technology's changed too. I mean, when the evidence was like grainy photographs and like VHS tapes, which have been copied from copies from copies from copies,
Yes,
now
yes,
like grainy. That's one thing. But yeah, it's remarkable with all of our like super high tech phones, which have like I don't know how many megapixels this thing have. It, it it's it's suspicious when we don't have bona fide verifiable evidence.
yeah,
And but then again, I mean, it's there are those who claim they do, and again, I make no judgment over whether their evidence is true or not. I'm waiting to be convinced.
yeah. Me too.
Is there any UFO religion? Because we've got about a minute left, just before we wrap it up, that you're looking at the moment that kind of has your interest peaked.
There is a group in California which interested me, whose founder claims to actually be from outer space, or rather, their consciousness is from outer space. So one of the terms used for this is often a star seed. So sort of they think they actually are an alien visiting us. And so I just started that project, and I can't say much yet besides the fact that I'm sort of reading their stuff because I think it's interesting, because that's actually a really fascinating claim to make. Is I'm not an Earthling aiming for the stars. I'm actually from the stars here on Earth.
Okay.
That's really interesting to me. So I'm just starting to do that research.
Oh, cool, man. That's super interesting. Well,
It is fascinating.
thank you so much for doing this. I could probably talk for ages. It's like
Oh
you give
yeah,
us,
it's been a
but
pleasure.
yeah, I
Yeah,
know you're
thanks for
busy,
having
but
me. It's
you're
really
a busy
fun.
man, so I know you're busy. But how do people want to find out? They can get your book. Any
Yeah. You
links?
can. Easiest thing to do is just sort of Google me. Benjamin E. Zeller is how I publish. You can find my Heaven's Gate book. It's wherever you buy books. And then I think I'm on Twitter too. I think I'm Zeller Prof on Twitter, and you can find me around. So
Okay.
yeah.
Good, Mai. Thank you so much for doing this, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.